Listening to Kaspars, and I was thinking how I actually started writing a little bit different ending for my story. But so there's going to be a bit more material than you're going to see in the slides. But the slides themselves, let's move on. Indeed, let's start with what philosophers do as a must. They have to define what the basic terms are. The first term we need to define is what individuation is. And I tried to go easy on you because Jung writes extensively about the subject, but it's easier to think about individuation as some sort of natural process of development which is somewhat similar to ripening of a fruit. When a fruit is ripe, you know what happens. Fruit falls. In a pretty much the same way, you can understand individuation as falling of a ripe fruit exactly at the right time. Okay, so I thought it's just a token, symbolic token of speech. Okay, all right. I hope you heard at least some fragments of what I was trying to say. So individuation is a natural process of development, of moving towards psychological wholeness. And wholeness in Latvian has a nice ring to it. When we say veselīga, it means both whole and health. So wholeness and health here comes into one notion. Transition from and this is important for the stuff we do in men's groups, trying to solve the old mystery of how a boy becomes a man. It's a transition from psychological childhood in a psychological maturity. Now, here's a bit heavier explanation taken from Daryl Sharp from his Jungian lexicon. Individuation is a process informed by archetypal ideal of wholeness. So here the archetypes enter. And archetypes, and at this point I would like to turn off the lights and put on some smoke, because whenever you talk about archetypes, it has to be a little bit dark and mysterious. So, and some Gothic music in behind. So this ideal of wholeness, which depends on vital relationship between the ego and the unconscious, an increasing awareness of one's unique psychological reality, including personal strengths and limitations, and at the same time, deeper appreciation for humanity in general. So you see what individuation does to us. It shows us ourselves, but at the same time, it teaches us to see others too. And you can always recognize an individuated man by also his ability to notice others. There's basically two parts of individuation. First half of life, we devote to establishment of a healthy, functioning ego. Ego is important because it's the center of the consciousness, and consciousness needs some sort of a center. But whenever we establish the one, and it usually happens around 35, 40 years of age, what happens is a strange thing. When the fruit is ready, it falls. So second half of life, if it ever happens, because some of us never really transcend this childhood phase, we always say, stay up, attached to the tree. The tree is the collective unconscious that fills us with juices of whatever collective symbolic forms are floating. So the second half of life means journey into darkness. It's a fall downwards. And the key word here is death of the ego. So that, what we were strengthening, making as functional as possible, building a career around, now has to be dismantled. Now, James Hollis, who has been translated into Latvian, calls it the second adulthood. Some other thinkers call it second puberty. Well, measure as you want, it's the second. Now, but what if the ego doesn't want to die? Jung writes, fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego, and this fear is often the precariously controlled demand of the unconscious forces to burst out in full strength. So now you see that self-sacrifice needs to be done in order to release the potential captured in the unconscious. But then no one who strives for selfhood is spared this dangerous passage. For that which is feared also belongs to the wholeness of the self. This means that in order to become whole, we need to overcome our one-sidedness, our ego consciousness. This means literally getting rid of ego, we get rid of consciousness. Now, how weird is that? And why is that supposed to do us any good? We were considered to be mentally healthy because we control ourselves, because we're able to control our unconscious impulses. And now all of a sudden we have to release it all. Even more. We have to give up certain things, such as compensations and ego defenses. And that is social status. That is a professional identity and career. That is sometimes toxic relationships. By the way, toxic relationships can be easily used as defenses against reality because, you know, the problem with toxic relationship is it's not real. It's not a real relationship. It's actually a form of suffering and self-torture we inflict when we learn to move towards healthy relationship. Ideologies and beliefs. And this is perfectly natural for a person to undergo when they're undergoing individuation process, to all of a sudden, from a hardcore scientist and rationalist become spiritual. From a supporter of ideology to somebody who criticizes that ideology the heaviest. And of course we have to give up the illusion of control. And I mean that in an existential sense. As Freud said, and I think he was very much right about it, ego is not a master in its own home. And that's the realization of it. But how much damage is needed to dismantle the ego? You see, with masculinity, sometimes it is the case that men, being a stubborn and somewhat autistic and living in denial, will deny that he is in crisis, almost to the point when it is easier for him to die than to recognize that he has lost control. Because even to some extent we could say that suicide is a form of retaining control. At least I make that decision. The decision is still mine, so I'm not completely overwhelmed. So letting go of control is often accompanied with depression and anxiety and existential dread, but Jung is weird in that sense because he says neurosis is by no means a negative thing. Think about it for a second. We always treat neurosis or depression, for instance, as something bad that happens to us that needs to be cured. We go to a doctor, a psychiatrist, a therapist, and we ask, I feel sad. I feel my life is useless, pointless. What I'm doing makes no sense. Give me a pill that I could carry on and be happy about it. And Jung says, no, you're supposed to be miserable because you're doing dumb things. If you carry on like this, this will not bring you any happiness. So here's 3 ways how we can move towards individuation. The first is what I just described, a personal crisis, which breaks the shell. And it could be a painful divorce. It could be a burnout. It could be death of a loved person or sometimes an animal. Sometimes our dog is the closest person to us, or a cat. Now, cats have a special time these days in Latvia. We've made one cat very important. So, and distress and suffering is supposed to weaken the ego so that it releases control. Second, it's the good old inner work, but who wants to do that? Nobody. We only want to read about it, so we buy books about how to do it. But, yeah. So, that means spirituality or psychotherapy, or if possible, simultaneously the same thing, although of course that would beg an explanation, how would you combine, not to over-psychologize spirituality. So, but the idea is that ego deliberately surrenders. You see, with that inner work, we can actually show the ego that it makes sense to surrender to something bigger than itself. And finally, we have psychedelic therapy, which encourages and supports the person's complete psychological surrender to the psychedelic experience. That's quote from, Scott Hill and his wonderful book on the confronting with the unconscious. Now, all of this has a compensatory relationship. It compensates one-sidedness of us. You see, for Jung, a very important idea was balance and harmony between the opposites. So if we have very strong ego consciousness, we have to have equally strong unconscious archetypal self. And now it's time for that self to prove itself, to kind of come up the stage and show itself. So the goal of psychedelic therapy is to create optimal conditions for the subject to experience ego death. See how Jungian is this sentence? And the subsequent transcendence into so-called psychedelic peak experience. It is an ecstatic state characterized by the loss of boundaries between the subject and the objective world, and with the ensuing feelings of unity with other people, nature, and the entire universe and God. And that quote comes from LSD psychotherapy, which is Graf's model on how this should be done. So if you're looking for models, for instructions how to do it, that's the book you should take a look into. Now, but besides that, there's work of Ronald Sanderson and his wonderful cooperator, Margot Kuttner. Margot Kuttner, by the way, is Jungian. Sanderson himself wasn't, but he was a psychiatrist working in the outlook or in the spirit of C.G. Jung. So Sanderson pioneered his work with LSD in 1950s, and he provided clinical foundation of psychedelic enhanced therapy. Now, here's a little terminological nuance here. Psychedelic therapy is not the same as psychedelic enhanced therapy, because psychedelic therapy is something that focuses mostly on psychedelics, while psychedelic enhanced therapy is therapy that uses, to a certain extent, psychedelics as a tool. So, but that said, I will use them more or less synonymously here because we don't have that much time to talk about what would be the difference and the technicalities of it. So continuing, oh, I just switched, oh yeah. No. We were, yes, we need to talk about this. So that in 1960s, he coined the term psycholytic therapy, from Greek word lysis. Psycholysis means loosening. And that's the basic idea of the kind of soft-core psychedelic therapy, because this uses low and medium dose model to enhance the therapy. This psychedelic therapy might go for the big doses or full doses, and there's a purpose why one needs to do that, because again, death of the ego. Now here we come to the interesting historical thing, because Jung's friend, Father Victor White, theologian and also somebody who's underwent Jungian analysis, talks about his experiences with the patients who were experimented upon with LSD, and he writes, "I was invited to Worcestershire Asylum to talk to the staff, and as I found, tried to lend a hand with religious archetypal material which patients were producing under the drug LSD." So here you see a priest coming to help to decipher material produced under LSD. This kind of shows that this material not only makes sense, but it has some recognizable archetypal patterns that could be followed. So you need someone who can read them. And he writes to Jung, "I wonder if you have met this drug. If not, you would be interested in the reports on it, which I could get for you." And guess what Jung says? Jung says, "Is this LSD drug mescaline? It has indeed very curious effects, of which I know far too little." In fact, here I have to say, Jung didn't try mescaline himself. He confesses that in a different letter, which is not quoted today. "If I should take it now," he says though, "I would not be sure at all if I had not taken it out of idle curiosity." So for Jung, this work is not valuable because he would say, I would do this for entertainment, not for individuation. Think again about weekend with a LSD or some other substance. "There are some poor, impoverished creatures," he says, "perhaps for whom mescaline would be a heaven-sent gift without counterpoison, but I am profoundly mistrustful of the pure gifts of gods." it goes further. It's just as if a surgeon had never learned further than to cut open his patient's belly and to leave things there. And this, dear audience, is a fair warning to anybody who participates in some kind of rituals or any other things offered by people that don't really know what they are doing. Why? Because in my own limited experience with the local scene of this, I've seen way too many times how easy it is indeed to open people up and then not be able to close them, not be able to sort of, because people, and this is another thing, that something is in us wants to go deep down in the psychedelic experience, but we need assistance, competent, good assistance in helping to put it all together. And I'm emphasizing this because it was the careless and reckless use of psychedelics in the 60s that led to so many bad results that actually gave bad name to this. So we have to be careful to distinguish skillful application from just careless, unreasonable playing with things that the person doesn't really understand how they work. So when one gets to know the unconscious contents, one should know how to deal with them. I can only hope that the doctors would feed themselves thoroughly with mescaline, the alkaloid of divine grace. I think that's a beautiful name, even though, of course, Jung uses this sarcastically. But it is indeed an alkaloid of divine grace, so that they learn for themselves to its marvelous effects. Now, what needs to be understood here is that ego becomes altered by this. So whenever we use psychedelics in profound sense, we are basically altering our consciousness, not just expanding, but changing it. We are, I haven't heard the first part, so maybe I'm now going wrong, but to my understanding, especially psilocybin is related to creation of new neural networks in the brain. So it's literally altering our perception, so not just expanding it. Now, Jung also answered to Alfred Hubbard, who invited him to contribute to psychedelic research in 1955, and he writes as follows: "The method of psychotherapy, as in active imagination, yields very similar results, that is, full realization of complexes and numinous dreams and visions. These phenomena occur at their proper time and place in the course of treatment." So Jung wants to say that if you do therapy right, you basically can substitute psychedelics with therapy. Now, but that would open up the opposite option, wouldn't it? If one would be substituted by the others, then the vice versa would work. Let's see how that happens. Mescaline, however, uncovers such psychic facts at any time and place when we were, it is by no means certain that the individual is mature enough to integrate them. So, the point is that whenever you open something up, it needs then to be integrated, it needs to be structured and put back together. So Jung's answer to Hubbard is that the possibility the drug opening the door to the unconscious could also release a latent potential psychosis. That's one of the risks. And that's one of the risks when people should be following and seeing and thinking and vetting maybe those who enter life-changing experiences and asking, is this person truly ready to encounter their unconscious? It's not about whether they're willing, they might be willing, but what would you do with a person who becomes psychotic and effect of the drug wanes, but psychosis never stops? So the outcome is this. Jungians, as of this tradition, categorically reject the suggestion that psychedelic substances can advance individuation. That, I think, is old news. First of all, because it used to be the case. But since we are advancing as society and our research in psychedelics, of course, is advancing, as Scott Hill notes, the lack of objective discussion of psychedelic experience or reference to psychedelic-induced imagery in the Jungian literature is remarkable. So Sanderson responds to this criticism. He says, Jung has fallen into his own trap of voicing prejudiced opinion without knowing anything about what we were actually doing with LSD. So this Jungian criticism kind of comes from also Jung's personality. Because one thing you have to know about Jung is that he could access his unconscious in some ways much easier than we can. He didn't have those strong boundaries holding or differentiating ego consciousness from the unconscious. His dreams, his visions were manifold and they were very powerful. One would say, at least that's how I explain it in my own mind, that Jung was kind of able to do the psychedelic trip without actually taking anything. That's why, of course, he looks kind of frowning down upon everybody else, thinking that, why do you guys want to open the gates of all this, if I have a problem of keeping them shut? And you think that you're going to, help yourselves with doing that. We're not all Jung. For some of us, it is very difficult to access this. And actually, his friend White asks by the end of the letter, actually, I have some problems in my therapy. I can hardly access any content of the unconscious, so maybe I should try mescaline, of course. So he comes to this conclusion that for him, not being Jung, but being deeply curious about this would be beneficial. So now, Sanderson also follows this, that he responds to criticism as such. Jung's charge that we had opened the belly, but had no idea what to do next may have applied at some centers. So he admits some mistakes were made, but he himself kind of says, we were aware about that problem, and we had more faith in the unconscious as a self-regulating organ. This is very, very important to understand, that when we talk about human psyche, we talk about a thing that has some homeostatic mechanisms. Not just being able to be damaged, but actually being able to tap into that potential of self-healing too. And Jung seems to have not too much faith into that. I'll skip this slide for the sake of brevity. It just says that Jung is really appropriate if you want to understand your psychedelic experience. And the book I'm quoting is, now this is the cover of the book. I've quoted it several times in my presentation. But now let's go to conclusions. What are the conclusions? First of all, integration of unconscious and archetypal content is central to Jung's concept of individuation. You are not individuated if you haven't been down there, if you haven't fallen. Yet unconscious content is so strange that their interruption into consciousness often amounts to psychosis. Now, see what he's saying here. Here he says, wait. Whenever we go down there, it's still psychosis. So first of all, he warns, don't take any drugs. You'll become psychotic. There's that risk. But if you do individuation, you still become psychotic. So which one is it? Which way should we go? Either way, we become slightly unhinged. His key concern, therefore, I think, should be placed on the fact that we do not integrate that experience. That is the problem. And why don't we integrate? Because whoever goes to a retreat with psychedelics doesn't take his therapist or her therapist with him. Therapists only later hear about this horrible experience, if ever. Maybe a person is so ashamed to tell about what kind of nonsense they went through that it never gets integrated. All right, now, so my conclusions are, maybe you'll call them overly optimistic, but I see it this way. There's positive potential of psychedelic-assisted therapy, as long as an analyst is present during the crucial experiences. So I think that if the competent analyst who has him or herself also experienced psychedelic states of mind is with you in that works way better and it makes much more sense. Then, an activation of archetypal healing mechanisms. This is also what's important about psychedelics, is that in another letter, Jung writes that psychedelics don't produce transcendental experiences. It's not like, because I take the drug, I have mystical experience. No, because I take the drug, I get access to the experience, which turns out to be mystical. See, it's not creation of that experience, it's just removing the obstacles of having it. That's why when we meditate and do the inner work, we can achieve the same result. It's just way more difficult. So now let's ask us, is psychedelics a certain shortcut? it might appear so, but I wouldn't call it shortcut because it still works. It's not like things are miraculously going to sort out just because you took the right amount of LSD or any other substance. No, you're still going to have to integrate and maybe re-enter the field. The good stuff, or the good idea about psychedelics, is that it takes away the barriers that would otherwise make you work for years and years in tackling the problem and still not succeeding. One good example is MDMA application to PTSD. War veterans with severe PTSD, with suicidal tendencies, with basically no medical help would be provided to them. No help could be effective. And then all of a sudden, this substance helps them to enter the field of trauma, do the inner work, and emerge healed. So why we need the psychedelics is to get courage and to get access. It doesn't solve the problem itself, but it does build a bridge towards solution. Yes, and what is solution? Solution is becoming whole. Solution is becoming integrated. So what we experience in those psychedelic trance states is the feeling of wholeness, which is only a possibility, an end state of therapy, one might say. If we do not experience those, we might have very faint and very vague idea of what we are actually doing, what we're going forward towards. So psychedelic therapy could somehow shine the light at the end of the tunnel just to give us enough motivation and hope to move forward. And it can help us to also meet our shadow self. So yeah, so there's a lot of potential, and I could probably go on, but I should stop myself here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. We have time for one very short question, if we have such. For me, takeaway from your talk would be, like Shakespeare said, to be or not to be. That's the question. To take or not to take. That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you.